you need help with anything?
No, just the last minute kind of. I realized that some of them are pretty meaty and it might be helpful to have the paper, and so I was going through, I was like, oh, well, if we're going to talk about this, it might be better to have it in hand.
Will you help if I go get pens? Reason?
I'm not sure that adds, I don't know. It's hard to, it's hard to kind of anticipate where you think people, right, where you think people will live with that. Yep. So you kind of know instantly that you've gotten it wrong because you made the same number of copies of everything. Different numbers left over.
Good.
Yeah.
Get your cough drops in. Okay, I got you. Trying to
Move
take
the
two.
mic over.
No worries.
Debbie's not joining us. Is
She'll
there
be
anybody
remote.
else? Oh, she is.
I need?
I thought she said she's not going.
So that means in the email, so when I looked at my calendar, it said Debbie remote, we're also on vacation, so let me confirm what was
Oh,
my most recent.
okay.
Karen, was
How's
the,
this on location?
the most recent.
I didn't know. And Debbie will not be remote today?
She said she wouldn't. And Ross?
I knew nothing
I
about
thought he'd be
that.
here.
Okay, I'll double check my,
Unless he mentioned something to you.
no, I literally saw how much it was in the calendar invoice, and then that's right.
Policy party.
Karen, hello, hello. There's 29.
How are you feeling, Maya? Better, somewhat?
So.
Oh,
It was
good.
turned the
Then
wrong
I
way,
just-
so I was like, I guess I should turn it around.
Try not to talk to you. Something is in here that's not supposed to be.
It was about when I opened
Oh.
the calendar, so it's,
Oh,
see,
That's not a good sign.
Jesus.
Yeah.
That's maybe he mentioned.
long time no see. Huh?
I know, and I apologize. I'm gonna have to leave early today also. I just have such a busy time for me right now. Sorry
It's
about
the
that.
season.
It is, yeah, it's really crazy.
See.
Yeah. You're running the calendar.
Is Debbie calling in?
No, she's not joining us. Okay, it's
No,
5:30,
okay.
so all right.
With Student Director Freeman, he said he'd see me all 3 evenings.
All right. I'd like to call the work session to order. And this is a meeting approximately for 2 hours. A special meeting, work session on policy review, revised board protocol guidelines, and discussion on the RFP for independent auditor services. Director Strauss is excused for tonight. And Director Hardy, I'm not quite sure if he will be here tonight.
So, good evening, President Beckenbauer, members of the board, Dr. Watts. It is policy time again, as I said before we started. It's time for another policy update. We have 2 hours to cover and another collection of policies, as well as a few policy-related loose ends. And so I'd like to start with 2 things that needed some space during a public meeting time period for the board to have some discussion. One of them is directly policy related. And that relates to the revised protocol guidelines. So what you have on that very lengthy piece of paper in front of you, the legal size sheet, are the current policy, the current protocol resolution for the board. And this came up when we were in the midst of updating policy 1420 around agenda setting for the board meeting, regular board meeting agendas. And there was some discussion amongst the directors around how they get information to the superintendent through the president on the board agenda and what that looked like. And there was additional discussion about where that happens, and then finally Director Strauss said, that happens in our protocols, do we want to have a discussion around that? And it was said that we'd create space for that during the next meeting, and so this is your space to discuss what that would look like. And so I provided for you the current protocol. It is a resolution that is adopted, not annually, it's typically adopted when there is a change in board directorship, change in superintendency. The majority of the items here in terms of the numbered guidelines 1 through 15 have been in place at least for the last 10 years that I can see. Numbers 14 and 15 I think speak most to what you all were talking about in terms of agenda setting. But now I'm going to stop talking and give you all the space to discuss what you'd like to see in the
All right, I'll start with Director Daniels.
So what I don't see is, so I've heard that so there's an agenda setting meeting that happens with the vice president and the president, but I don't see that here. I see we agreed to ask the board president or superintendent to place an item, unless I'm reading through it, so if I'm missing it, forgive me.
That was in the policy.
That was in the policy of what the policy stated happened. It is not in our protocol, and so that was where the alignment of, well, protocol says one thing, policy says another.
Right.
What could that alignment look like? And so if it needs, because you all discussed several things, having that conjunction as a joint with vice president and president. You talked about a protocol of kind of a rolling support, meaning president and an additional board member, so that everyone had an opportunity to kind of have that conversation. So there are several options presented of how that would like to happen, and it really is up to you all. WASA doesn't necessarily have guidance on how you all set agenda in that way, other than being very cautious to not violate public meeting when trying to set the agenda.
And for context,
Yes.
Director Daniels, the 15 protocol guidelines, and we've had this discussion over my 4-year tenure. Item 14 on the protocol guidelines is the one that speaks most closely to that, and it's interpreted, or could be certainly interpreted as a meeting between, that has evolved between president, superintendent, board president, vice president, superintendent. I wanted to make sure that was noted.
I like the idea of a rolling, like have different opportunities for different board members to join the president in that. I think that might be a good process. I've heard a couple of other districts do it that way.
Karen, any thoughts?
No, I'm fine with that. I just definitely think we need to make sure we have the agenda setting meetings every time before the meeting. When it says, we agreed to ask the board president or the superintendent to place an item on the agenda, to me that speaks that all the rest of us can convey that message, that we want that on there. So I don't feel like this needs to be changed as part of our protocol, but I think it needs to be clearer in that policy that we'll have the president and a rotating board member attend the agenda setting meetings. But that's just my thought.
Let's see. A few things. Because I was not here on this particular day, you won't see my signature there. So I had a couple of things to discuss, not just number 14, but I also wanted to talk about number 9, communications between the central office administrators and the school board are encouraged. And that second line, board requests are to be directed to the superintendent. I feel like that those two sentences are two different matters, and I wasn't quite sure when you discussed it last time, how you arrived that as being one of the same. So I just wanted clarification first. Then I have a recommendation.
Honestly, I don't remember us changing that at all.
Yeah, I don't.
So we didn't have any discussion around this protocol prior. It was, the protocol was presented as an option to fix kind of the discussion that was happening around policy 1420, which was agenda setting. We've
No, no,
now
I
opened the
meant
door to
on-
full, oh, so I,
And on January 24th,
Oh.
that was the meeting where I was out of town,
That's right.
out of the country.
Right.
So I wasn't here, so my signature's not here, so I was just wondering how that
I
came
don't even
about.
think it was discussed.
Okay.
I think we just went with what was there.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't remember.
Yeah,
So
I
I
don't
just
think we talked
wanted
about it,
to kind of, I don't know, I feel like that communication between staff and board should be encouraged, but then also make a statement that we recognize that timely, open, and constant communication regarding school district issues is extremely important, and will strive to anticipate issues which may become important or sensitive to our school district and district stakeholders. Make a stronger statement about that communication and why that would take place. So that's a suggestion I wanted to throw out, because I feel like,
Where are you?
Would you?
number
repeat that?
9, yes.
Just substituting what you're saying for what number 9 is.
Yes, so I'm suggesting, the first line, okay, is fine, but that second line, it didn't make sense. Board requests are to be directed to the superintendent. It doesn't seem good. It seems somewhat in conflict with that first statement, not understanding why we added that second statement. So I'm asking to make that language a little bit stronger and to say that communication between the central office or staff, I don't know, it's a central office, but staff and the school board are encouraged, so that there isn't a sense of, well, we're not allowed to approach the board. There's always been that fear. We're warranted, but I am also suggesting that we say, we recognize that timely and open and constant communication regarding school district issues are extremely important, and we will strive to anticipate issues which may become important or are sensitive to our school district and district stakeholders. Meaning that if we see these patterns of concerns, which I suspect a thought exchange would capture, program like thought exchange, we ought to have the opportunity to be able to speak with staff members, not necessarily go straight to Dr. Watts to get an answer for everything, but we should feel comfortable in receiving feedback from staff. That's
For the thoughts or input, I certainly have some suggestions and some considerations as well.
part of it is that, when people approach us, we're always waiting for a response from the district, and that takes a long time. And so I recognize, it's not simple answers. But if there are staff members who, I'm advocating for a more comfortable position where staff members don't feel as though they can't be honest about the situation. Say if I have a question that I want to ask Ben, I should feel comfortable doing that without having to go through a formal process. So those are kind of things that I don't feel like right now it exists.
I feel like what, can you say more about that? What Are you saying you don't have an opportunity to speak to staff? Or staff doesn't have an
Well, I
opportunity to
don't
speak to
feel
them?
like it's encouraged. That's what this says. I don't feel like that is encouraged. And I'm not saying that somebody has told us explicitly, don't approach someone, but I don't feel like that's understood because there's real fear. But I shouldn't say real fear, there's fear of staff approaching the board. And I don't like that culture of fear. And if we've engendered that, then I think that becomes problematic. So what is the kind of verbiage we can put in here that allows for a freedom of conversation?
I heard you say a couple of things, if I may.
Sure.
Freedom of conversation is one. I think, ironically, I don't see, or I've seen evidence that there is not the fear that I heard you mention. I'm not sure what, specifically what you mean from a broad base. There's a culture of fear. I'd love to hear more about that. And for sake of our conversation today, a couple of things. I think that my understanding is we had this protocol to help communication be more effective and efficient. We've talked about this, I think, every year. What does it mean to have a conversation with, or ask a question to staff, or to have a community member ask a question to a board member? Depends. And I think we've talked about this before. I don't know that there's any board, school board director, that's expected to know everything about the school district, which is, that's understood. And so one of the questions I would ask is, how do we then respond? So if I'm a community member and I come to a school board director to say, hey, can you tell me about this, fill in the blank? If you do know, no one's saying you can't have that conversation. I think I'm trying to make sure I understand the difference between knowing the answer or being able to respond and not knowing and being okay, and then to come back to staff or to me to say, hey, this is a question that came up. We've worked hard and smart. We're not quite there yet. But I think that's part of our process that we have in place, because what we want to avoid, so I'll pivot to what we want to avoid is the understanding that board, staff, superintendent, communication should be directive. What I mean by that is part of your role, as we know, is to focus on the what we need to do, or if there's questions that come up. We've already shared examples that you've had conversations with staff or with me. We work to discover what those solutions are, and we get that information back to you. If there's a timeliness issue, we can talk about that, certainly. If there's concern about what we know and don't know, and I remember our conversations, I think we have to be comfortable not, I know I don't know everything when I'm asked, and I have to say, hey, I'll get back to you, and here's the process. So saying all that, what is it that what problem is it that we really want or
Yeah,
desire to
I
solve?
guess I don't understand when it says, how are we encouraging that? The communications between central office admin, and we say that, and then the next sentence seems incongruent with the first one, to say that board requests are to be directed to the superintendent. So
What
there's
would
some.
you suggest?
So I guess I would take out that second sentence. I don't really understand why it's there. But then I would just make it very clear what is meant by encouraged. And that's why I'm expanding and saying that we recognize that timely, open, constant communication on school district issues is extremely important. So then in that regard, communications between staff and school board are encouraged.
So I wonder, it sounds like they're two different things, actually. So I'm thinking about, when it talks about communications, I see with board requests, so that what I read that to mean is that if we ask for something, that we need to ask through the superintendent.
Right.
And
it's a
so we
separate
wouldn't be asking,
sentence.
I think it's separate, but, and so it wouldn't be necessarily appropriate for us to ask, for me to directly ask Mariah or directly ask. Those requests go through the superintendent. I see them as actually two different things. Is that kind of,
So the idea of
And I get
the
that.
word
It
is
makes sense.
directing is really
right, and that makes sense.
the key phrase, right?
But I do agree with the timeliness, because there are lots of times when we're waiting for information for quite a long time, and sometimes we have to request repeated times, and so I do appreciate the fact that you're bringing up the timeliness, because that doesn't always happen, and sometimes it could be because of the layers that we have to go through to get the information.
Absolutely.
So maybe, so I do understand what you're saying, Maya, as far as the sensitivity and the timeliness of things.
So I'm saying,
Yeah.
make that the statement, that
Yeah.
we are looking for that timely, open, and constant communication. And in that regard, that communications between staff and school board are encouraged.
Is this a statement you crafted?
I'm
or-
suggesting.
Okay.
Yeah.
So a request is asking for something. You're asking for something to be done, whereas
Right.
a conversation could just be a conversation. If I wanted to talk to Mariah about something, I could talk to Mariah, or I could talk to them.
Yeah, this
Easily.
is communications,
Yeah.
and the second line says requests.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so those are two different things. So request, I mean, if you want to put that as a separate number,
Right.
because I think that the superintendent needs to know what we're asking for. If we're asking for something in return, not just having a conversation. If we're asking for something to be done, then yes, that needs to go through the superintendent.
Yeah. So that's my point, is that they're two separate sentences.
Yeah, so make it a different number.
Doesn't make sense. But then, yeah, what does that mean, encouraged? You know, there has to be, it has to make sense that we're encouraging timely and open
Yeah,
conversation.
The board encourage, so 6 uses the word as well. The board will encourage others to present their own issues, problems, or proposals.
Yeah, that's to present. This is, number 9, and to me, is specifically addressing communication regarding the school district with whomever.
So what I'm wondering is, this is, so I know we can get into the never-ending challenge of groupthink and trying to shape language today. If we can agree on, and I'm wondering if we can agree on, if there's a protocol that, at the very least, we know, or we can agree, or consensus that we need to review it or reconsider the language. I have some thoughts on what could be added, if I get a sense, because I look at, I remember having similar conversations regarding item 6 about a similar topic that's related to number 9. So, and I've said this before, I think it's time that we review, but for this session, it may be more advantageous for our
Okay.
time just
Yeah.
to say, hey, I think this does need to be
Okay.
reviewed. Is that
Yep, we
something
can move it.
and
Yes.
just one other thing, when it says board requests, to me, that means the whole board is requesting something, not board members, individual board member request. So,
So I was going to say that and actually remind that in making the request, and there are sometimes that board members have individual questions.
Right.
They may hear something from a community stakeholder or other, but being careful that once they have that information, that if it's good for one board member to know, is it good for all to know? And then how do you share that information without violating OPMA and some
Right.
other things in terms of sharing that information? And so there's a fine line to be walked there as you think about redeveloping and redesigning what that looks like. And what sharing that information might look like as well. And that gets into, I think one of them addresses that, about a single board member kind of acting as an authority, and then what that means when they know something that others should then know, and how do you
yeah.
share that without creating another issue. And so I do agree that some of these may need to be looked at as maybe a larger group of protocol, and there might be time outside of policy session, because I didn't know that we were opening the door to a full protocol redesign, and that sounds like more of what we're getting into.
We can
And so I think there's a space for that,
Yeah.
that might exist outside of your policy workspace, because this really is about kind of the core work of the board. And that's related to policy, but slightly different than what we initially opened the door for. But I did hear, so to recap kind of how we got into this, that in 1420, what you would like to see is some proposed language and a redesign about a board member and the board president working together on a rotating basis to set the agenda for the month. So possibly working through kind of monthly, this board member. And so I'll take a look at that. I may look at some other districts to see if they have formal language in their policy around that and bring that back to you.
And just throwing one more thing out there, number 5 says at the very end, board members will copy Kent board on all electronic communication. We sort of found out we can't do that, right?
Right.
So
CC or BCC.
we need to make sure we take that out of
Well,
there.
we
or-
can, we just
So
can't
when we say
engage
we
in
found
two-way
out-
conversation.
Yeah,
Let-
it's
let's
a
talk
sticky
more.
wicket.
It does get into a
Sticky.
slippery slope
It is
again
sticky.
of like, so it's sticky
It is.
around, is it a one-way conversation?
Yeah.
The minute someone
Right.
replies, then it
Right.
becomes a,
Yeah.
right. So it's a,
Just
Right.
throwing it out there. I don't mean to have a discussion right now, but
Yeah, that's
Yeah,
true.
we'll
No, that's
also
something to talk about
discuss
too.
when somebody sends something to me, it's expected that I copy the whole board, and that also violates. So
Yeah.
that can't happen either.
it likely results then in ongoing communication.
Right.
To come.
yeah. Oh.
Okay.
Are we comfortable with where we are? Okay.
Yes.
Okay,
Okay.
thank you.
Well, the whole point was to have some space to have it, so that there was time allotted for that conversation. The next one is a similar idea, and I'm not sure that you want to get into this deeply tonight, but there needed to be space on an agenda as well to at least discuss your plan for an RFP. There's not an attachment here for that, because I don't have a copy of it. But I know that you received it at the last board meeting. You all had talked about getting back together. Not suggesting that today is the day to do that.
Right.
But did you want to think about scheduling some time? The next regular board meeting is not until the 12th of June, so it's still a ways away.
Next.
But we are nearing kind of the end of our operating school year, and so that will approach quickly as well. So I didn't know if you all wanted some space to talk about kind of a timeline for when you all would like to get together to make a decision, or if there's other information you need from us to help make that decision or guide your next steps. So I didn't know.
Part of what the proposal is, they've presented a timeline, and part of the first phase is to be completed by May and June. So the sooner the better, I think. I mean, if we're accepting their proposal and we're moving forward.
They also work for you, so I would say that
Yeah.
you have some authority to push back on that timeline if you wanted to. So there's a little bit, but you're right, you do
Yeah.
want some things to start moving quickly because you
Yeah.
did ask
Right.
for certain things to happen at a certain time.
Right.
But
Yeah. Yeah. So I think we should add it to another upcoming. So we can, does it have to be a board meeting or can it be a work session?
no, it can be a work session. You
Okay.
just have to, it has to follow the OPMA
Okay, so
guidelines.
let's maybe
Um,
Plan it for, I'm sure we have another one coming up right next week.
There's a Wednesday every week.
I know, you guys feel it every week. Yeah.
Next week. Next Wednesday.
Okay, so.
Is there something already scheduled?
There is. We have, next Wednesday is a first one, so it is a 120-minute session. Right now, it is posed as an hour for policy review, an hour for budget update. I understand that we have a policy push, and I appreciate it. I think that at the end of this, the last thing we talked about was the WASDA update, and so we're going to talk about that before this meeting ends tonight. That may give us space if you wanted next week to have an hour conversation about budget, because I think it's important that we not lose that, especially if we're going to move with WASDA updating policy. We could give up that hour of policy so that you all can have space to talk about the audit on that week. Is a possibility.
Do we need an hour?
I don't necessarily think we do, but there might be questions with others.
You may not need the hour, and so we can always put policy on the agenda.
Yeah.
We can
See if it's
discuss
there.
things that are on the agenda, and we can not discuss them, and that's okay, but we can't discuss them if they're not on the agenda.
Yes, I apologize, but I also wanted to add another policy onto our next agenda, which is 1210. It's the one asking for board directors election.
Oh,
for
yeah,
board
that needs to
directors.
go, yeah,
You
that
know,
needs to
we
go
need to
soon.
consider what
We need to
we
consider
should
that
do,
very soon.
given the changes coming up.
Right, yeah.
I was
we do.
gonna bring
Yeah.
up,
Yeah,
there's a
we talked
couple
about
in there that
Yeah. Yeah.
can be addressed, or should be addressed as there's going to be a change in the board, and now that we know that there's gonna be a 3 board member turnover, that there's an opportunity of some things that can only be addressed when there's a transition in board leadership.
Right.
So this is an opportunity to look at some of those, and 1210 is an example, the other, I forget the number, is related to board member compensation. And so you can't talk about that when it impacts your serving term, but since the board members are transitioning, it's an opportunity to talk about and get some clarity around what reimbursements look like, what that process is, and those types of things. Okay, so I made a note of 1210, and would you, I guess, work with Karen then on the scheduling of the RFP, if you'd like next Wednesday as a real option for So now we're moving into our hardcore policy work. It's the 3rd reading of 3226, interviews, interrogations of students on school premises. And the policy was not the consideration there, it was about procedure. And so what you have in front of you, the next document in your packet, is actually the procedure. And it is WASDA model procedure as it exists. And I believe that at the time, Director Daniels had some questions around the interrogation process and what type of adult, or could an adult be present? Could we require it? What did that look like? And what Randy reiterated at the last session, and we believe to be true, is that we cannot dictate or mandate that an adult is present. We've worked with our colleagues in law enforcement, and they said that they will try to comply with that. However, they are the deciding entity on whether or not that happens, and that depends upon the situation in terms of whether or not the student being interviewed is victim or perpetrator, whether or not the parent or guardian is perpetrator in this and the child is the victim. It depends on the circumstances of the event that would dictate that.
Right, and it wasn't parent necessarily, it was just a trusted adult. So the
Okay.
question was, can there be a trusted adult in the room? It could be a teacher, it could be so it doesn't have to be a parent or guardian. And my concern was, is the student given the opportunity to
It's-
ask for?
So we cannot guarantee or mandate that they have an adult there. is
But
what-
that's not what I'm asking. Can we mandate that they have the opportunity to request?
But the request may be denied by law
Right, I mean,
enforcement.
so we can say that we can give them the opportunity to request, but the request could not be honored depending upon the situation. So we could put that in there. That's what I'm saying. I mean, like, I'm not saying that it can't be done. I'm just saying that.
So law enforcement says that there might be situations where they would only talk to the child in the room.
And that I totally understand, just I think what I talked about the last board meeting or whatever was that, because this also applies to school district safety officers and the students I just have one student I had a conversation with, as I mentioned, whatever last time we talked about this, was that they weren't given the opportunity to ask for a trusted adult. And of course, it can be anyone, but I just read this. In here, there is not the requirement to let the student know they have a right to request.
Right, well, they
And,
don't, it sounds like, so.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
Right, so they don't necessarily have a right to request, we
Right.
give them the
It's just not
opportunity to
there.
request,
right,
right?
right, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, so that's the hard part.
It is. And I don't think that that's language, again, that we can't put in there. It just puts it in an interesting situation. If I understand your perspective as being student advocate focused, to have a student then ask for that and then not be able to
Yeah,
provide what
and
they've
it
asked for.
can be a traumatic experience for a child, and so I think that, are we considering whose safety are we putting first, right? And not that you can't get the information from a student, but when they're traumatized, it's much more difficult to get information from a student. So it seems to me like it might be a logical way to approach it, but anyway, yeah.
Okay,
I will state that in there, it does say that the principal or designee will be present unless they're being told they can't be. And so, in a sense, they're hopefully
Yeah,
filling that role.
yeah,
So,
yeah,
That's the spirit of the
yeah.
policy.
Mhm,
commissioners, any other thoughts or considerations?
No.
Question is, when a lot of this occurs, and the principal always is informed, or someone designee, and it really is, Dr. Trump said, it's dependent on the situation.
Right.
It really is. Many times we have CPS or other,
Mhm.
types, things like that. That one is really on criminal, it's underneath criminal activity.
Yeah.
And so it's really dependent on, so the officer or law enforcement, if it's not gonna hinder the investigation, they'll let a designee in there, but it's really up to them is what we're saying, it's dependent on that case, because we don't even know what the case is sometimes. When they come.
And I just have a verb agreement problem with, on Part 6, interview of students sought by immigration agents, Part C. To be valid, the warrant must state the purpose of the interview. It should say, identify the search location, reference a specific person, include an accurate, and be signed. So the identifies and references should be singular, not plural.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Dr. Harmon, you noted that.
Made a note.
thank you.
That is the other big piece of this, that is, and we've been encouraging our school-based leadership to understand the nuances of the immigration piece, and talking about that when policy came up before. That's a big piece of this, that is a positive, is that it, given our student demographics, it places a sense of security and onus on sure that our students and families understand that school is a safe space.
That's it. No other questions? Move to the next one.
So aside from the changes from Director DeGruler, am I hearing that this is ready for fourth reading and approval?
I'm concerned.
I understand that procedurally there's, and we will continue to do our best to be student advocates and be student forward. But, next is policy 6022, fund balance. And this is a third reading. When last we looked at this one is printed out to you so you can kind of see the iterations of this one. This one is not as heavy, but as we last spoke, you seemed more interested in the idea of a number of days of what the fund balance would cover, and that's what is reflected there in the green language. And you also expressed a recognition that in reference to the fund balance, it is, although it changes monthly, but the fund balance and the adherence to the policy applied on an annual basis is what it seemed like you were saying. So yes, you'd monitor, but in terms of developing a plan, following that plan, it would be based on the annual fund balance, and then the plan would be developed there. So the language reflects that acknowledgement of the fund balance commitment is for a fiscal year, and then the 13 to 15 day range. And if it falls below that 13 days, you talked about a plan to restore the fund balance that is monitored. You talked about quarterly. And so I think the piece that is missing here is the exact amount of time or how often you would want to monitor that plan. You talked about quarterly. Is it monthly during budget update? What would that look like? There's the time bound of within 60 days of the initial submission of the budget. We talked about it being presented kind of hand in hand with the budget adoption. But then how would you check on the monitoring of that plan? Next phase of work.
So, I guess,
No, you're good. Yeah, I have no issue.
so, one of the things that I think we'll need to understand is where exactly the fiscal recovery task force is headed. And I know that, this is a big part of their direction in monitoring. So I don't want to give a charge to them. I'm waiting to understand exactly where they are. But this was a big part of that, maintaining our fund balance or making sure it's used to its best advantage was the main objective. So in that sense, I would think throughout the year, there would be a monitoring of, even though we're looking at 13 to 15 days of current year's operating expenses, we're looking to see at any given point in time, are we there, or how much we're deviating from that set objective. So, so am I understanding your question, like you're expecting how this should be presented to the board?
Right, so what would the board like to see in terms of a plan? So it's one thing to say, okay, we're asking the board to adopt this budget in August for the next school year in operations. And, oh, by the way, we are presenting you a budget that is spending down fund balance, and here's our plan for recovery of that. And then we don't look at it anymore throughout the year. And so what I'm saying is, it's, yes, we've checked all the boxes with the policy, but the spirit of that is to then monitor and review that plan to ensure that we're actually making some recovery strides, or where are we in terms of that. And so that has not really existed before, and that does leave space for either involvement with the fiscal recovery task force, or at least, if nothing else, talking about that the board would like to see a quarterly presentation of the plan. It can be that simple, and then procedurally we can work through what that relationship with the recovery task force looks like and how those pieces happen. But it does kind of codify in policy that it will show up with the board on a semi-regular basis, or whatever that looks like.
Because this really goes hand in hand with our budget discussions, and if we're looking at our operating expenses, that being one of the big variables, then it makes sense for us to know exactly where we stand in terms of the fund balance.
The other thing that you asked about, because the WASDA model policy is very sparse. It pretty much just gives you 2 sentences and then a blank to put in the percentage amount that the district values. We talked about the cases in which a district would need to spend fund balance. It talks about catastrophes, emergencies, and those types of things. It doesn't talk about appropriate expenditures per se of that. So, and that, I think historically some of the challenge of how we've gotten where we are and how difficult it is to get out of that hole is that when you spend on recurring charges, so for example, if we needed to spend fund balance to cover operations costs like utilities, they are not going to go away. They're not going to be any less the next year. So then how do we, then the recovery plan for that would be difficult to describe, because we spent fund balance, maybe for a legitimate need, but on a recurring cost. So I think possibly thinking through appropriate expenditures for fund balance might, not saying that so it's not saying that absolutely this list of things is the appropriate things to spend on, you can only spend fund balance on these things. But having that as an awareness in the same way we talk about conditions under which we might likely spend, here are the types of things that it would be spent on, might be helpful as well. Because it would be a reminder to all of us in the future, if we were faced with those tough decisions, what that would look like.
So I was looking at the verbiage there, in that particular line, the amount calculated by taking fiscal year's budgeted expenses. That in itself is it's not really clear in the sense that budgeted expenses can be committed funds or not committed funds. So would that include categorical funds? You know, we're not being really explicit in what that budgeted expenses mean.
And so what we could do, instead of making it current year, we could talk about calculating it by taking the previous year's operating expenditures and dividing it by the days of operation to get an amount. Similar to a percentage of the overall budget, doesn't really break out the pieces of this fund or that fund. And we can do that, which kind of separates it from the current year's expenditures and sets it in stone that way. but it still doesn't get to when you all as a board are faced with the decision of adopting a budget or a recovery plan around so that impacts fund balance. Is the district making the appropriate decisions on what they're spending it on? And that's where I'm kind of opening up that space to say in the policy, what are those pieces? So there's what you asked for initially is to keep the definitions of the types of fund balances there are. The one that has been of the most discussion is about the undesignated unreserved or the unassigned fund balance. And it talks about the conditions under which we might have to or would cause a district to spend those. But it doesn't say, and then on these types of things.
So, I mean, you're signifying what those could be. And so if there is a statement included in that final paragraph where we're talking about the calculation of it, we can say in consideration of the above, that these expenses could be predicated on potential unforeseen changes, and we list that down below. So I think, I mean, that's a suggestion. I don't know, board members. Any thoughts?
Not so much on that. I was thinking about the plan. And so I know we've seen budget updates. I know we've seen financial. Have we seen a plan to replace the fund balance so far?
No.
So, okay, so then my question is then, I would be interested in what that looks like.
That's exactly the conversation at the door I opened, is what would you like it to look like?
I would like it to look like, this is where we are. These are the adjustments we plan to make to accomplish this at this particular, or whatever that looks like, whatever the goals or the timeline is what I thought we were talking about when we would spend. I thought the conversation was when we would spend the assigned fund balance. And I'm thinking about, well, what does the plan actually look like? Because I haven't seen a plan the entire time. And so that's what I'm wondering. So my thought would be there would be I don't know if it's quarterly probably is the best update to say, this is what we're doing, but an actual plan to do so. And like I said, I don't know what that looks like.
Because right now it says the restoration plan must be reviewed annually.
Well, it
by
said
the
that
board.
before, but we have been doing it.
No,
So
the
it said that,
at the very end, it said annually, not
But, yeah.
quarterly or whatever.
It
so.
said the same thing here. It just was the 3%.
Oh.
So I'm saying that was scratched out, but we still haven't done that, even though it said it before with the 3%. So that's what I'm wondering.
And so that's why the suggestion was at the last board meeting when this was discussed,
sure.
to present it, the initial plan in conjunction with the budget. Because
Absolutely.
the budget
That's
at
right.
that point in time would reflect whatever restoration process or procedures we put into place over the course of the next fiscal year.
Absolutely.
So once that happens, my next question was then how often does the board want to see how we're progressing toward that? So if in the fall we presented to you, here's a budget that still shows that we are out of compliance with the 5% fund balance, which, so this fall will be close, but we will still be out of compliance with that. So we would present a plan for recovery. And then at some point throughout the year, I would expect that the board would want to know where we are with that. And that was the question of,
Yeah, I would
right
think
now,
quarterly.
we present a plan and then we walk away from it, or do you want to see an update of that? And that's when we kind of got into a conversation about, well, procedurally, we can work with the Fiscal Recovery Task Force on what that looks like, but how often would the board actually like a formal presentation at a board meeting around that?
Well, I think they're expected to present with the budget
Right.
team quarterly, I think we
I
said.
thought it was quarterly too.
Yeah, so this seems to be in tandem with our budget presentations. It's all aligned, so I would think not just procedurally, but it would make sense holistically. It all happens at the same time. Part of their responsibility is that monitoring.
That's okay. I've got to go but I'll call in. Is that okay? Can I call in your cell? Sure. Okay, I'll call right. I got to go take, sorry.
So yes,
I'll call in just a minute.
lost my train of thought. So I think you have that, Dr.
Right, so I just
Harmon.
made a note about the plan presented at least initially.
Right.
And then a quarterly presentation of that plan, but in
Yeah.
conjunction with the Fiscal Recovery Task Force.
Yes,
So that'll,
and they will be monitoring throughout, is my understanding. So that step we have to keep in mind as well, you know, the presentation of where we're headed, the trajectory. So we may not, I mean, this fall, we might be, but down the road, you know, we may be aligned, and that's their charge, is to make sure we get them back on track.
Yeah.
So,
Question on the cadence right now, the timing, how frequently, fiscal recovery task force?
I think it's this quarterly.
Okay.
But I think we said after 3 meetings.
Okay.
Because they're not ready yet
Right.
to present to the board.
Okay.
But in time, you know, once they're caught up with the charge and they're all in the same page, I think there would be much more coordinated effort.
so I did not at all expect that this would be ready for the next round of approval. I thought that it would go to another reading because this is core work and pretty heavy. So I will
And
say
we'd
that.
like your input too.
Right, and we will see this policy again at the next reading, and it'll have some iterations of that language as well. And may work with Fiscal Recovery Task Force to send them a draft so that they can be aware of kind of what's here and what that could look like. And then I'm sure we would work together on some procedural things.
Which we want to put in the procedure that the Fiscal Recovery Task Force would be presenting with quarterly about the restoration plan,
We
or is
just need
that
to see
already?
what it's in their action plan. I think that's
Is
what we
is that already
agreed.
put in there? Because I asked, because if we're changing this.
We don't want to change.
No, if we're changing the policy, does that have a consequence effect on whatever policy or procedure we put in place for the Fiscal Recovery Task Force? Because I can't remember.
No, not the
What they
policy.
put in about, you know, them presenting quarterly. Do we want to at least put it somewhere, or at least ask them about presenting quarterly? Would that include their thoughts on the restoration plan?
Yeah, I think we put their restoration plan, I mean, that is their main charge, is to protect the fund balance. That was the main objective. So in terms of presenting, I think the verbiage we used is regularly meet, present to the board. So that was that's the determination of the committee, and so that's something we can ask, we can request.
I just made a note to check the resolution for the Fiscal Recovery Task Force and to share the draft, the next iteration of this with them.
Yeah.
The Fiscal Recovery Task Force is a finite timeline. I mean, it's not going to go for more than maybe 5 years at the most. So putting it in the policy probably is not,
Okay.
stating that in the policy is probably not.
Well,
The right thing to do, but yeah.
I originally said procedure because I know
Yeah.
procedures can change without having to approve the policy. And from what I just remember, several months ago, is it was said they would be there for several years.
Right.
And so if
3
this
to
gets
5
reviewed
years,
several
yeah.
years, I just figured you could take it out in several years once the Fiscal Recovery Task Force, you know.
Just have to be aware of it, yeah.
Agreed.
Denise, can you hear us?
A little muddled. I couldn't exactly hear what was going on. I heard a little bit. I can hear you pretty clearly.
Okay,
We're closest to the mic. We'll
okay.
we'll check in.
All right.
Dr. Watt.
About 2 feet from the phone. We got a microphone at the other end of the table as well.
So the next policy is a first reading of 2190, highly capable. I did not print this out. I will talk about more the spirit of the changes and what the technical changes are. And then it's updated to comply with the legislation and reflecting an emphasis on recruiting and prioritizing identification of more low-income students into the program. It did not really specify how that happens, so that discretion is still left up to school districts. But it does talk about some pathways that we were already utilizing but it does open the door to new possibilities and considerations. So the idea of local norms, we were using already as a strategy, and had been using that for a while, and that's the idea of creating, looking at the averages of performance within a building and how that is used, rather than using national norms even. And then it did put in a clause that is nice to ensure the spirit of this, and that they can be used, but not if they are more restrictive than the national norms. So you wouldn't use local norms if they are less inclusive. And then it talked about some things that have a more different impact given our student demographic, about testing in the student's native language, and if that is not available, having nonverbal assessments as an opportunity to assess. And so that does open a door for access to highly capable programs in a different way for students in Kent. And then it talked about other subjective measures. So the idea and practice, not that it was one that we were using, but to use grades as a screen out or screen in implementation there. And so it can't be used to disqualify, but it can be used in conjunction with other data points to qualify a student as additional evidence. So
Yeah,
that's
I'd be
the
really
spirit.
careful about using grades, because we know that highly capable kids come in all different shapes and sizes, and some of them are very much underachievers and are really bright, but choose not to perform.
Yeah, I
So
agree with you, Karen.
we need to be really careful about that.
We're speaking of a preponderance of evidence, maybe more
Right.
than one.
Right, right.
That's a, do we know?
Yeah.
And so while this does open up access in new ways, there are funding considerations with this. And
I can't hear anybody talking, I apologize. Is it possible to use, and I looked at it, but I didn't get a chance to use culminating work, like a culmination of work instead of necessarily grading?
Yes, we can use a culmination of work. So grades are not the recommendation as the primary source of information. So they can only be used, they can only be used as additional evidence.
Can you hear that, Denise?
Oh.
Denise?
Yes, I'm here. I
Okay.
can barely hear.
Oh, okay.
So I said it can only be used as additional evidence. It can't, the grades cannot be primary evidence.
Just maybe repeat what Joel has said so she knows.
I still can't hear you guys.
So grades,
It's okay.
grades cannot
There
be
you are.
used as,
I hear you now.
grades, what Dr. Herman said is that grades cannot be used as primary evidence, but could be used as supporting evidence in the qualification process.
Okay.
Okay.
There's an opportunity, then you said, for like a culmination of work review?
We did agree that that is a possibility, and certainly we could consider that as an option.
Okay. Okay,
Yes,
thank you.
absolutely.
And so what will rest on this, most importantly, probably for the board, although you all don't approve the procedure, would be the procedural implications of this. And so working with our chief academic officer, you will, I'll say that maybe this will go to a second reading so that you can review the procedures in conjunction with the policy. That may help address some of Director Daniels' concerns, but also kind of lay out more of a Kent-sized plan of how we intend to implement.
Maybe we should have Jewel move down here so she'd be closer to the phone, if she's going to be the number one speaker.
What do you think?
Okay. We're asking Dr. Herman to move so you can hear Denise.
I had a question.
Thank you.
Yeah, I had a question in the third paragraph about the term productive thinking. It says, and creative or productive thinking. I'm not sure what that means.
So I will not pretend to be an expert about this, but there is this idea of creativity as a
Right, I know
form of
that.
giftedness.
I know, I just didn't know what productive thinking meant.
WASDA does not define productive thinking, and I am not sure how I would define productive thinking. That is exactly word for word WASDA model policy.
Right.
If the productive piece is a sticking point for the board, we can strike productive and keep creative, because I think there is a concept of what that looks like, and creativity as a form of giftedness.
And I know there are instruments to measure creativity. I just didn't know if there was a way to measure productive thinking. I mean, as a teacher of gifted, I never had anything like that, so.
It's very similar, so I would call it a synonym, and this is one theorist or author, Canadian author, Tim Herson. Productive thinking, under the name productive thinking model, was put forward by Tim Herson, Canadian author. He proposed a structured approach to solving problems, so it is about creativity and generating creative ideas. Structured
Okay.
approach combined knowledge with creative and or critical thinking. So
Okay.
it's a term that I think we're unfamiliar with, but the concept we are very
Yeah,
familiar
yeah.
with.
So I was saying that we would likely move this to a second reading, Director Daniels, and it would show up with the procedures. So although the board doesn't approve procedures, you'd have that kind of good to go hand in hand when you took your next
Okay.
look.
Okay.
3.04.
Okay. This is the first reading of our employment disclosure certifications, requirements, assurances, and approvals. And this update pertains mostly to just background checks for all staff and volunteers. The most significant update of this is that WASDA changed the language to clearly state up front that when they say staff, they also mean volunteers. And that was an important piece of slight, subtle language change in ours, because we talked about kind of staff slightly separately and had some procedures and things in place for staff. But it wasn't very clear in the upfront that a volunteer, although they are not staff, so they're not saying that they are on payroll in that way and have the same rights and responsibilities. They do have the same responsibilities in terms of background check. And us having some regulatory control of them having access to our students in supervised and unsupervised capacities. So,
We don't do fingerprinting here anymore, do we? Isn't it?
No.
Do we? We do? Okay. So going through VIPs, I mean, volunteers thing?
So those are done differently, but employee fingerprinting is done here. We don't use ink anymore. We use electronic.
Yeah.
And so that speeds up the process, but this.
And volunteers that you use the
So there's no fingerprinting for volunteers, is that right?
They run
Washington State Patrol?
Yes.
Yeah.
They want the Washington State Patrol, correct.
Okay. Because some of us don't have fingerprints anymore.
You mean like literally on your fingertips?
Yeah, we've worked so hard in our lives that the
Yes.
fingerprints are no longer there.
We know who you are. We work with you.
Just use your elbow, that's all right.
Do something different.
I figured I could rob banks now.
I
So I
have
had
fingerprints
a-
like that too.
I had a question on that first paragraph. The federal immigration law compliance for staff. So I think that whole paragraph, part of me is, are we doing this exactly as it reads? Like, the board has the legal responsibility of authorizing the employment of all staff, and we have the legal responsibility, but then it goes on to talk about administering the recruitment process. But at the, I think it's the last line, as required by federal immigration law, the superintendent shall certify that he or she has examined the documents which were presented to me by the new hire. So there's a combination of what the board's responsibility is, what the superintendent designee responsibility is, and then finally what the superintendent shall do. So it seems to me as though there's no separation of duties there that are highlighted, and I don't know, it just seems problematic that it reads the way it does. Am I crazy?
So Dr. Watts is not looking at every single I-9 that comes in. Yes.
Right.
So what's happening is
As much
he's
as I would like
designated that to me, and I designate that to staff, and we have checks and balances to ensure that that happens.
Yeah.
But I understand your concern, just
Yeah.
the word superintendent is there, or.
Yeah, and also, I guess I need to really understand when it says the board has the legal responsibility of authorizing the employment of all staff, that authorizing the employment By what means?
By the personnel report. So every single hire is required to be on the personnel report or a supplemental personnel report.
Okay, but this is falling under the immigration law, and so we are not authorizing in the sense that we don't have any of that information.
So we do not place anyone on the personnel report that hasn't followed these
Okay,
steps.
so I guess I'm asking for more clarification to go in here, because our role is limited in the approval at the personnel report level, and I feel like this is saying something very different than what's happening now.
I wonder, can you say it in a maybe a different way? When you're asking, what is it that, as a board,
What is
You
the
don't-
legal responsibility, and how do we authorize that employment to specifically state that, what that means? Because it's falling not under authorization of employment of staff, but it's falling under the legal responsibility under the federal immigrant law compliance for staff. And so the board responsibility is falling under what is supposed to be under staff. So there's a little bit of a mismatch.
So although this is WASDA model policy, I think that particular sentence could almost be moved out and sit apart from the entire section. So federal immigration law compliance aside, or any of the other issues that are listed here under that, the board does have the responsibility of authorizing the employment of staff. So every employment decision, whether it is separation or joining the organization, is approved, or the board takes an action on that.
It's an
So,
action.
right.
It's our
And-
CIU as well, that you have to be the one to terminate or hire.
Yeah.
So,
And I just look at it, that's just, the first sentence is the big umbrella statement for everything else that goes underneath it, but if separating it out.
right, I said if
on
it's helpful to
own
move
is
it out to
fine.
stand alone, that's
Yeah.
okay, because it's a
Because it's
statement
saying
that
it's
is.
for staff, that's the heading. It's
Mhm.
not for board, it's the staff.
No, I think that's a good catch. It could be misleading.
Yeah.
It does read that way.
And then, yes, it said the superintendent or designee
Mhm.
will check or examine the documents. That would be
Okay.
correct.
You do.
Absolutely.
But we can add the clarifying language, that's perfectly fine. And then it talks about background checks for staff and volunteers with a little more specificity. And kind of puts it in a way where it talks about, it cleared up the language. So although we addressed conditional employment and some other things, it just kind of, it organized it differently. We didn't lose anything that was there in terms of our belief systems or actions. But it very clearly aligned staff and volunteers kind of in the same language together, rather than saying, here's what it says about staff and here's what it says about volunteers. It's like, no, staff and volunteers, here are the actions, here's what needs to take place. And it covered every cross intersection that I could think of. Staff and volunteers, certificated staff, regularly scheduled, conditional employments. All of those things were covered so that there isn't a gap in terms of, oh, well, this type of person doesn't need to go through these procedures and protocols.
And is that true, that the district shall report all new hires to DSHS, DCS? All new hires?
So,
Under child support reporting, it should say those that are applicable.
so as required. So if
As
you,
required.
if you don't have an order, then there isn't anything to support.
Yeah,
And
so
or-
we should probably change that sentence, right? Because it says, shall report all new hires to DSHS, DCS, as, well, as required.
It does change the obligation.
Okay.
What's
but-
your
Okay, I
thought?
don't know, it's just. It's saying, I mean, that sentence is saying that's required, as required by that, all new hires will report to the State Department, right,
Well, I
Mariah?
like to keep it from getting the next reading, just get you clarity on that.
Yeah,
particular.
yeah.
We'll share with you the process. I know that
Yeah,
there is
you
a
just need to
process.
move that around, I guess, the verbiage.
So whether or not it's all being required, all that are required, or
All
all
that
staff
is
as required by
required.
the law, we'll
Right.
get clarity on that
Okay,
first.
thank you. Yeah, we're probably being nitpicky on some of these, you know. But in general, I understood, Dr. Harmon, the intent of combining that and making certain that it's all covered for staff and volunteers.
And I think the biggest piece of this in the redesign was that volunteers were somewhat of a left-out group in this. And it is ensuring that the people who, in the right spirit, we're giving access to our children, that they are following the same level of scrutiny that we would if they were an employee.
In the field trips that you approve,
Yeah.
as it relates to volunteers, it's specific that the role is a volunteer for KSD school district. So
I'm good with that. I don't know.
And so I was not expecting that this go through right away. This is a pretty heavy piece of this, and I know that there would be some questions where HR would maybe want to go back and add a lens, have a different look, and bring us back to the second reading. And so the next is a similar name. It is employment contracts. And this one is more about aligning with previous language around NCLB. So there was some NCLB language around there about highly qualified teachers, which is not a thing in the same way anymore under ESSA.
Yeah.
There's also some language changes in terms of requirements for paraeducators. And so that is reflected in this WASDA update as well. It talked about consultancies and what that looks like, and not necessarily, so it's talking about employment contracts and those in terms of term contracts. So they're not being offered an annual contract, that's not at all what it's implying, but it's laying out language in terms of what a consultant contract would look like, under which conditions would a consultant for the district be hired.
There are two sections on supplemental, there's supplemental contracts, and then there's, the wording is similar in parts of them. I didn't check totally, but some supplemental employment agreements.
Yes. The supplemental contracts piece is the WASDA language of that, and I apologize. I thought I'd move them up to be together, and I guess I did not. I thought I'd put them together. So
Okay.
WASDA's model language along with kind of our Kent language, and I just had not moved them, so I
Okay.
will move that up
Okay.
in the second reading. They were not meant to be redundant. It's just a slightly different version of our process and a description of our process related to WASDA model language, and they should be together. I thought I'd made some of those changes where they were all moved.
Well, this is the WASDA language, so the classified staff contract. So it says upon recommendation, contracts for selected classified staff may be in writing and or for specified period of time. It doesn't indicate that it has to be given.
Right, may. That's why the language is,
We
right.
don't currently in Kent School District give contracts for classified employees. So
No.
just wanted to delineate that even though it's there, it's the may, that's important, just in case you ever wanted to do that in
Yeah.
the future.
And it was not ever really addressed one way or the other in the previous policy. So it didn't really mention that. And so that's there. It is not a condition related to any RCW or WAC. That's why it's a may. And that's why I said this particular revision from WASDA addressed all employee groups in terms of whether it's a supplemental, whether it is a full-time term certificated position, our paraeducator requirements and consultants as well.
Denise, any questions?
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay.
On the classified staff contracts, it's just very short. It says, upon recommendation of the superintendent, contracts for selected classified staff may be in writing and/or for a specific period of time not to exceed 1 year. Otherwise, the employment of classified staff will be on a month-to-month basis commencing from the first day of work. So they could be terminated at any time, basically. Okay, okay.
Unless they have a collective bargaining agreement that speaks otherwise and provides allow them the rights and other.
And who would determine whether they were no longer employed? I mean, how does that get determined?
So all terminations have to go to the board, and so certificate has a whole set of things that we have to do with classified employees. If there's a recommendation or a notice of intent to terminate that's provided to them, that allows what we call no rights, so they have the opportunity to have a hearing, and then it goes to the board. They have an opportunity to share with the board through writing any disagreement they have before you take final action.
Okay, good.
Questions?
Be good.
And this will likely be a second reading, so I'm not anticipating that this move on right now at all. But we needed to get it moving before next year. The next is appropriate staff and student interactions. And you actually have a printout of this if it's helpful to see it kind of hard copy. Because this one was it is really interesting. This came up in the fall when we were talking about homeless students was the discussion. And at that time, there were questions about what were the options and rights, responsibilities of staff and adults who cared about those students.
Okay. I've got it here, so.
Who cared about those students and what they could do and what was offered. And we talked about the risks and liabilities of that without actually talking about policy. And so what this does is it talks about the policy around those interactions. And it doesn't necessarily call out that particular example, but it does talk about boundaries with students for the student and the staff member's sake and the importance of that. And this doesn't exactly align with what the thinking of the board was, but it does lay out protecting district interest and responsibilities in that, because when the board allows that in policy, it puts the district as the accountable party if something were to happen on either party's side.
So at the time this came up, I was the one who brought that up. We had an administrator interested in assisting a student at their home. And so the argument that was made was that other school districts are somehow allowing that process to happen. So I'm just curious if we've done any research into what other districts are doing in terms of supporting students who are homeless, experiencing homelessness.
So in terms of students that are experiencing homelessness, we didn't, when talking about that policy, look at what other districts.
So I know in our district, because I had brought this up too, there was an instance where a family had been dislocated and had given permission for a student to stay with a particular staff member. And so I'm wondering about the, so I understand the liability, but if that liability is released, then if parent gives permission and that's something that's done, I'm wondering about the appropriateness in that case.
So I think that taking over guardianship of a student, even in a temporary status, is a legal process. So I have, anecdotally, I have a family member who has done that temporarily for one of their child's friends whose parents were moving out of state and they didn't want to go and all of that kind of thing. Anyway, and there was a legal process so that they could have the right to register the child, to attend parent conferences, to take them to the doctor and all of those things. And the district was not involved in that way. That was handled outside of. And I know that, so Auburn does not have a policy that speaks to student staff boundaries in that way. So they don't have a 5253 policy. And their homeless student procedure talks about it more in terms of the rights and responsibilities under Becca and not around staff support. So they kind of stay away from that in policy and informal language.
Yes.
So it's one of those things where if the family and the staff, district staff or otherwise, choose to engage in this process, the district won't interfere or won't engage. But I think that, at least it appears from the policy perspective, Auburn has shied away from weighing in a formal way through policy.
Right. Because it's not something that's, I mean, I would say it happens all the time, but it's not uncommon. It's happened in at least a couple of instances I know. And it wasn't even necessarily a parent out of town. It was just they were living somewhere where it was, in particular, you know, it was difficult for them to get the child to school. And so just to make, the parents still had authority, the parents still did, but it was just, you know, just staying there during the time so they could make the ease of getting to and from school a bit easier.
So
But again, it's just different, right? So I don't know.
So it does talk about, the board recognizes that staff may have familial and pre-existing social relationships with parents or guardians and students. Staff members should use professional judgment when they have a dual relationship. To avoid violating this policy, the appearance of impropriety and the appearance of favoritism, staff members shall proactively discuss these circumstances with their building administrator or supervisor. So it does put some disclosure responsibilities there.
Right.
And we can have a conversation with our insurance carriers about the risk associated with that. So we could, if need be, put a dollar to what our liabilities could be if there is an instance of impropriety or problems. So that at least it's a known, as we're continuing to work through this, so that it's a known or understood risk.
But also a process by which that can exist, that relationship. Because I think if you just have it in the policy without defining what that looks like, you know, how would we get that permission from the family? You know, not
Right.
really following through on the particulars. I think that poses a lot more risk than if we had a process in place for that particular paragraph.
Or addressing an unaccompanied minor, right? Because that's an issue also.
We want to think about.
So we can think about what that looks like. We can,
Because the insurance folks, I would think, would want to see what that means, that particular paragraph means. in
and so
terms
I'd be
of risks.
curious if there is other case law as well of what that looks like in terms of risk for other districts. And I would consider reaching out to some other districts
Yeah.
that, so I think about Seattle in this, not because they are or aren't doing it, but they actually have a legal staff and a legal team, so we might be able to leverage their knowledge on what this looks like and how they are dealing with this, because I'm sure it is something that every district deals with, whether they deal with it in an official capacity through policy, or it is one of those unofficial things that is happening, and so getting some more information about that. But I knew that it was something that we discussed before, and since there were some updates through WASDA around this, it was a good opportunity to bring it forward and try to fix
So I
Yeah.
absolutely agree. I think we should take a look at it from a risk management perspective with our clear risks group. And just speaking to the need for 5253, I think it's imperative that a district have a policy. I won't speak for other districts, but I will speak for Kent. We have used this policy many times when we have boundary issues. specifically speaks to what is appropriate and not appropriate in your interactions with students. And I wish we didn't have to use the policy as often as we do, but we do use it. And so that speaks to the need for clear policy and procedure about what is expected of our employees when they're working with our most vulnerable, our students. And, it's not like they're working in an industry outside of K-12. Because we are K-12, it's absolutely essential that we have this language. So, and I'm preaching to the choir. My point is,
Right.
We need it.
And this is another
That
one
needs to
that
be
also
clear.
defines volunteers as staff. So it does not excuse our volunteers from, and so setting aside the kind of long-term care of a student in terms of a student staying with staff, it does speak to other interactions as well. So interactions and use with social media, and really defining that relationship, and that's very important, especially when I think about volunteer status. So our volunteers that have a temporary interaction with our students and then develop a social media presence, and kind of putting some parameters around that as well. So,
Dr. Harmon, it's not calling out volunteers, or maybe I missed it.
so at the very beginning, the first
Oh,
sentence
the first-
starts with the purpose.
Okay.
The policy provides all staff, students, volunteers, and community members with information about their role. And then it says, for the purpose of this policy and its procedure, the terms district staff,
Oh,
staff
sorry.
members, and
Got it.
staff also include volunteers.
Okay,
So
thank you.
from the beginning, there's no question about if a volunteer in this instance
Okay.
is considered a staff member of the district.
Thank you, I missed that. Thank you.
As I'm reading, do you want to put like a new section that specifically, because I don't know if it's going to be elaborating on at-risk students, staying with staff or whatever you said, what risk management says. Do you want to put like a new section? Because as I'm reading, it just kind of goes from general standards into talking about staff having family relationships. So that, in my opinion, that's just kind of, they're related, but they're also two separate.
I agree. I think that if we are going to go down that path as a district, it needs to be a completely separate section. Because then that creates the space to say, kind of, here's where we're deviating, but here's, what that guidance looks like if we move forward in that way. It would be a separate piece. I don't think it needs to be intermingled with kind of general standards or other pieces. It needs to be set apart so that it's clear, that guidance in the policy.
So what I'm also hearing in reading is that there's a presumption, if a student-staff relationship were to come about, that the only option to consider is whether or not to have staff-student relationship, or staff cohabitating, or taking a student in as an option. What I don't hear are the options that so let's go back to our original concern, I think it was about a year ago, or two. What are the community-based organizations and options, social programs and support systems that are already in place to provide that, to address the need that may exist? I don't see that explicitly stated in this language, and my wondering is, do we need to?
We can.
I know that came up in one of our conversations about a similar incident.
So, second,
Yep, absolutely. These were not, I didn't believe that these would be a one and done, but given where we are with the year, I wanted to make sure they were moving so that we could have them in place at the start of next year. And so now we're moving into a series of policies around operations, finances again. This next policy, Policy 6000, is new to Kent School District. And mostly it is timely because it reflects a requirement now under the law to have a 4-year budget as part of the annual budget development process, and it just being a good practice and keeping in line with what's happening. I'm sorry. Just like something happening. And so it lays out the program planning, budget preparation, adoption, and implementation process. It defines a fiscal year rather clearly for the district, for our public. It talks about the budget preparation notice, the requirements of submission to an ESD and to OSPI, what those deadlines are. It talks about the budget notice hearing and process again, and what they are, and then what that implementation looks like. And so it is just a very clean and nice way to talk about the district's obligations around who they have to notify, how the public are included in the budget process, and the roles of ESD and OSPI in this.
Well, one of the things that I noticed on this is, I think in that hearing and filing section, we are, I think, earlier in the, I think it's page 2, we're saying that the public will have some participation in, I think it's in the second page on top. It says, program planning and budget development will provide for staff participation and the sharing of information with community members prior to action by the board. But then we move on to the filing, and it's clear that where they're participating is really on that day where we're taking the public hearing and taking action. So I feel like it's not really clearly stating when the public will have an opportunity to weigh in, and then it's also not clear how the staff is participating in the budget development.
So, so a couple of things. This is direct WASDA model policy. The other of this is that it aligns with what the requirement is so in that respect, it aligns with what the requirement is under the law. So the law says that there has to be a public hearing, and the public has to have an opportunity to address the board around a budget. And so that typically happens as it's outlined in this particular policy. If there is a different interest in terms of having, I would say, public input on this, then that can take place as the board sees fit, and that's part of what this discussion is. Just a second. So as far as staff having to weigh in on the budget piece, that happens as they are setting their MSOC budgets, as they're doing their planning. So by the time the staff portions of the board have been brought to the board as part of the budget package for adoption, whether it is a school-based staff and that principal and administration have gone through that process, or communities and teams have sat down to talk about it, I would say, I know that each of us as chief officers, and I won't speak for them, I'll say for me, I've had a conversation with each of my direct reports and leaders of those teams to talk about what their MSOC budget looks like for next year. We've gone through line by line and talked about what those expenditures are, what the essential needs are, what they can cut. We look at it in relation to what they've spent this year. And so there is this consideration of what that looks like. And we have conversations about what does that mean for development of your team. Other resources.
Is the building principals, are they involved in these budget discussions? I guess that's the question. Like, kind of, on a larger scale, not giving them specific numbers, here are the FDEs you need to come up with, but how are they involved in prioritization of what needs to be budgeted for from the building?
So meaning in their buildings?
In their
or?
buildings, yeah.
So in
For
terms
their
of,
buildings.
For their buildings, you're saying? So several conversations that they should be having, and that would include conversations I know that are taking place between their principal supervisor, otherwise known as their head lead. Typically,
How are the
Question.
principals involved in the budgeting process?
talk about that. Obviously, we talked about from MSOC, their own budgets, but I know we've had some conversations. I know I've spoken with principals. I understand you've had conversations with them as well. I do know that's been a point of concern. So how might we include additional opportunities for discussion, whether it be, obviously, they're going to have more oversight. That support schools, programs within the schools, but there's also the conversation about input district-wide. I think that's an area.
I think in general, the prioritization process, how do we not wait until that August hearing to make decisions? That's been the process the last several years, and I don't feel like it's been effective because there's no buy-in from the buildings, there's no buy-in from the community, and I think that's hurt us. We've had that, I think, one year. We did have town halls and, you know, the prioritization of the levy. And we made it it was 2014. You know, we quote unquote promised, I know we don't like that word promised, but.
I hear it often,
but
but I'm not sure what it means.
But that was what was prioritized. We went by what the community wanted from that levy. So, you know, I'm not saying in difficult times we have that opportunity, but certainly I think we need to work through some of the scenarios we talked about, you know, given these legislative changes. You know, and giving that community an opportunity to weigh in on those sort of scenarios.
And what we've done in the past is we've had, in the same meeting, we've had the hearing and then we've passed the budget. And so that needs to be separated from those two times. You know, there need to be a separate time where the community and the administrators and all can weigh in before. And so we've got time to think about it and talk to Ben and you and, you know, just.
We have done that. Go ahead. Follow up.
Not only do those two things need to be separate, but from my perspective, if we think back to last August, I don't think the budget should be adopted on the very first board meeting, because then if you vote to not adopt the budget, and then you have to meet again on a Friday to adopt it, move it up to earlier in August, so it gives much more room for not only flexibility and timing, because if it says the budget will be adopted by August 31st, then, you know, do you want to meet every single day between the August 22nd first board meeting of the year and August 31st if you have so many concerns? I think that might need to go into having board meetings start the actual the second Tuesday, just like they do of every month.
But how does that work procedurally and yeah, I don't know what the challenges are.
And I will say this as well. So it also says that by the 10th day of July in each year,
I was going to ask that.
that a 4-year plan has to be submitted.
And the budget.
Mm-hmm. And so there's something to the idea, there are districts in the state of Washington who have their budget finalized for the next fiscal year before the current school year ends. They've gone through all of that process. And even prior to this law being in effect and these changes, that was part of their practice and procedure. And so that is a possibility moving forward. It is an unlikely thing to achieve this school year because we didn't put that timeline in place. But if we're going to alter this process and talk about what it looks like to have public input, staff input, and adhere to an adoption before August 31st, the start of our school year, then that does look very different for us procedurally. And that means that our budget season for our district would start almost as soon as the current school year starts. So it takes us from starting our budget season, which most people don't realize starts in January, would really start more like September, October. So we are living and starting the current school year while planning for the next school year and having deep conversations about the next school year, which is fine, other districts do it. But that would be a definite shift for the district.
And how do you feel for the,
So without having consulted the finance team about this, I think that there are, like anything, there are benefits and costs to doing it both ways. The later you wait, there are more known things. So legislative decisions are more fully baked and decided. Most of the time, contractual conversations are happening in the spring of the next year, and that's, kind of resolved as the school year gets ready to start. A lot of those things are unknowns as you're going into the closing of the current school year. But on the other side of that, you are able to, as a building principal, as a central office staff person, going into your summer work, being able to plan for what you know will live in your next school year. So there's, like I said, it's not this is the right way and the best way to do this, and there's only wins on this side, or this is the right way to do this, and there's only wins on this side. It's more of a, what are we willing to commit to? And then how do we back into all of those things that are involved in what we're wanting to do?
And is this July 10th date, is this a new thing? This is, because we've never adhered to it before.
It's part of that 4-year plan. So what's the
Okay.
development of the requirement of a 4-year plan?
And that's new.
And it is,
So, yeah.
right. And so now we
Okay.
submit a plan, and that plan does change relative to new information. So last year was the first time we kind of started talking about this 4-year plan idea, and our plan changed because we had contractual things that
Right.
changed. And we've been kind of talking about our 4-year plan throughout our year, and we had a plan in early spring of this year, and then that plan changed because legislative decisions changed. And so it's a plan, and so we will revise and resubmit in accordance with those final deadlines at the bottom that talk about August 31st, September 3rd, September 10th. And the reason why it seems redundant to have that August 31st date, because at that point, there's no turning back. The board has to have a budget in place.
Yeah.
And so then the plan then becomes a reality, and that's when it is submitted as a final version to ESD and OSPI.
There's the beginning of some input, and I think it's important for us that is a constant opportunity, and from a communication standpoint. Melissa, if you would share what our initial steps have been.
So if you recall, when we changed how we did the state of the districts this year, we did ask for community input on the budget. Because with the changes in our paying attention to two-way communication and engagement and asking for input, we began in February asking for that input on the budget. And so we do have data to share on what those priorities were. We're working with our partners in DARTS to exactly on how to show that data display of what those budget priorities are, which was one of the questions to display. But from the responses on the survey, we clearly heard from those that did respond. It was a smaller percentage than those that actually engaged. We had, if you recall our community conversations in April last year, we had 88 community members, students, staff, and families attend in person, but over the month of February, we had over 1,600 unique visitors to the website alone, not including our social media engagement on the information that we shared. So a huge increase. Now, a small number of those actually responded to the survey, but when we asked specifically about the budget, they told us clearly what their priorities were, and class sizes and staff's salaries were the number 2 answers, and then it was a tie for the next 4 answers, which were specialized programs for students, facilities improvements, instructional resources, and performing arts. So we've begun that conversation and asking.
when was this? What time?
This was at the end of February when we
Yes,
asked.
yeah, things have
Going into
evolved,
March.
right?
And we left it open and we
Yeah.
promoted it through March.
Yeah.
And so we have, yes, and context changes, and but we did promote it widely, and so I think the notion though of asking for input, it's not new, and it's something we've been engaging in. And I think the other tools and things that we've been working on, like you mentioned thought exchange earlier, there are definitely ways to ask for input and get in ideas and input from stakeholders. Just wanted to share that we have been asking for input.
It's one of many opportunities that we can take advantage of. Continue to increase that opportunity given our our time.
I did not, oh, we lost
Denise?
Director Daniels.
Okay.
Okay.
I did not, again, this was not intended to be a first one and done. It is one that, again, I think just clarify some things for our public, for ourselves about our process. So that was the intent, and it aligns with what the law is.
Are we going to be ready by July 10th to submit something?
We will. We have, I think, we're working on 3 work sessions with our board before July 10th. So there will be ample opportunity to talk through some of these things. You all asked for it the next time we present, we were going to talk about some of those budget options, and what the change, so you talked about in a kind of global perspective of the changes of the legislative impact, and now you're going to see more detail about what that looks like in terms of our 4-year plan and some other things, and then what are some of those options of things that we've heard the board express in terms of expenditures and things that they'd like to see, and what that looks like. And then we, of course, will have to have a conversation about this in conjunction with the previous policy we just talked about, which is minimum fund balance. So how do we restore while still spending, and what that looks like? So, yes.
Yeah.
Yes, we will comply, and yes, we will have a budget adopted by the 31st with a final plan submitted in accordance by September.
Great, okay.
And so I know that this will go to second reading, but so it's fine.
Dr. Harmon, the last 2, I don't know if I'm assuming they're new.
Mm-hmm.
But we don't really have any context, so I didn't really understand. If you could give us a summary
Sure. So
prompted us.
again, so 6020 is about the system of fund accounts and how the state auditor's office now requires us to have a way to designate how we're spending local levy revenue and being able to kind of call that out, those expenditures. And so this policy is around that requirement. So that is why that exists. And so this is another example of defining for ourselves and our public, our different funds, what those funds are, what types of expenditures and revenue should show up in those funds.
And is this a WASDA developed?
Yes, this is all WASDA. That is why there's no redlining or striking through, other than a format change. I think there's a bullet out of the way, out of alignment, because this is all brand new. That's why there's no previous adopted date.
Need a little bit more time to look at that, but anybody else? Thoughts?
There's just I can't find where it is, but there's some mention of skill center.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that at there it is, skill center, minor repair and maintenance capital account. We don't contribute to the skill center, do we? Because I know at one of our community conversations, there was someone who said, why don't we?
Yeah.
Why don't our kids have access to the skill center?
Highline, mainly federal line.
Lake Washington, depending on.
We have our own CTE, it's
And
always
that's
been
our
said.
response.
Right.
Yeah.
And so this is more about this is if we were operating a skill center. And so if we were to develop and open one up or access to that, how would we then show that we're collecting those funds and those deposits from other districts for using that skill center? It is language that we can strike through and remove because it's not applicable, as we've done with some other things from WASDA that don't apply. But because this is the first reading and it's WASDA model, I wanted to show you the pure,
Everything.
and then we can go back through and talk about what does not exist for Kent or what should not exist in this for us. And that would be a piece that could be removed completely because it is not a thing for
Right.
Kent School District.
Okay.
But that is it. The law changed, and in that they wanted to call out then what that looked like in terms of funds for the district. So that's 6020 and 6100. Sorry. And so same kind of thing. This idea, again, is new for us as a district, but it speaks to Again, the revenues for local, revenues for enrichment. So as that law changed, it talked about that piece of it, but then it talked about the audit responsibilities of that as well. So if an audit, when the state auditor comes to do the audit, and if audit findings are found related to levy expenditures, then the district has to have a plan and a public hearing to talk about those findings and what will be done to correct that. And so a lot of these last two are more about the levy accountability as the law has changed and morphed. And so I wanted these to be on the books. They're just part of that whole goal of tidying up operations procedures. So,
Are additional course offerings, are AP classes considered beyond the
according to WASDA
basic
model
education?
policy,
They are?
this is WASDA model policy. This is not.
Okay. I mean, they could be paid for out of levy funds. Is that what this is saying? District can pay for the following with local revenues, so additional course offerings beyond the minimum instructional program established in state statutory program of basic education. So we could pay for AP classes.
Would that also include CTE classes? Are they beyond minimum instructional program?
So it starts to get a little bit, it is not a clean line.
Is that a specific question again?
Are AP classes, are CTE classes, are they just beyond the minimum instructional program that says?
Well, I'm seeing these on an AP, as far as I know, it's counted as basic ed, foundation classes.
It
And
is.
to an extension, would that also include the IB program at KM?
So it's interesting when you pull up the RCW and look at this, it's a bit of, I'd call it a bit of a rabbit hole. When I started to go down it and try to unpack what is and what isn't, because I figured that my board would ask about some more specific definitions of what exactly in specificity counts. And it isn't absolutely clear. So it's not like it says AB, it's not like it says IB, AP, or even AP courses that are related to core content are basic ed, but AP courses that are not related to core content are not. It doesn't get into that level of granularity in terms of defining. And so this is as stated in WASDA model policy.
So a better
And-
clarification of how the levy enrichment funds can be used, I
Yes.
guess.
And we may want to seek specific legal guidance if there are questions around some ideas of that. I know that WASDA says that they do their legal legwork as well and aligning it with RCW. But if we have specific examples that we'd like to be looked into, that can be done as well. So we can have some specific examples.
So does the legislature and/or OSPI now have a list of things that are considered enrichment? I mean, these are things that can be falling under enrichment, but jazz choir, is that enrichment? Jazz band, is that enrichment?
I can ask. I mean, it's, again, there's nothing that it is
Yeah.
one that is not, you see what's here and it's listed
Yeah.
and it's kind of, it doesn't get into a level of specificity to say these types of things are, these aren't, or even in terms of breaking down the credit requirements of and not and drawing a line. So we can, like I said, I can provide some specific examples and we can seek clarification to see if we get a definitive answer in that respect.
Because that would help us with the prioritization. So,
Yeah.
when we're looking at the scenarios.
And then it talked about, again, of course, I said like our audit responsibilities of that. So when the auditor comes, what we have to do, what we're bound to in terms of the findings related to that. And so these were all, like I said, all new to Kent, mostly because of law changes, not necessarily any particular problem or gap, but it's an opportunity to close those doors and make it clear and define our perspective and expectation for operations. So we are right on time because there's one last agenda item in our policy update. So although several of these are moving forward in our next round, and we'll, God bless you, will likely be the last round, with the exception of the 1210, of policies for this particular school year in terms of what we'll need to do to get them adopted and closed out. You talked about WASDA doing the update process, and so I reached out. I did not hear back from WASDA about, so they cannot confirm that $9,000 price or that particular timeline. So what they're, the only confirmation I have is of the $11,000 that we spoke of. And so my question to the board, and if you'd like, I can postpone this until other members are present, is to talk about what you would like to do to make that more formal. So I didn't take an action because we talked about, well, is it $9,000 or is it $11,000? Could they speed up the process? And so I wanted to know, it seemed like the board was interested in WASDA taking that on.
But
And
their timeline was
Their timeline
12
was not,
months or something.
right, their
wasn't it?
timeline was not aligned with what the board was expecting, and so
Yeah.
wanted to know.
It was 6 months originally, for 9,000, but Colleen is now no longer there, so I don't know if that's affecting, but there is a policy person there, and I don't know if that's who you.
So that's how I've been speaking with, and that's, I mean, so that's where they've stood, and so I'm open to, if a board member would like to reach out
Yeah.
and maybe make the
Yeah.
request, that
Sure.
could be a possibility, but I was,
Okay, so I'll let you know next steps.
okay. So that we can also get that moving before the close of this school year as well, so they might be able to make prime work happen over the summer so that there's this late as well when the school year starts.
All right, thank you so much for all the work.
So that's the final piece on the agenda tonight, and so we did it in our 2 hours. So.
Thank you. All right, we are adjourned. Good evening.
Thank you. Just one more thing here, just the wording is, I just changed it, inventories, comma, prepaid items or items legally required to be.
So it is so funny.